I fell in love with my neighbor's wife, but I think there's something wrong with her. I have never been a person who's kept many close relationships. It's never been my nature to let people into my life. I've always taken stock in being an observer, getting to know people from a distance. This trait is what led me to become so enmeshed in Monica's life. Monica Stevens and her husband Dylan were my neighbors and my landlords at my new apartment. I had just moved to the city from my small town, mostly to find work, but it didn't hurt that there were many more people watching opportunities here than at my previous residence. My apartment was not lavish by any stretch, but it was perfect for me. I lived on the top floor, a view of the rooftop garden from my kitchen, and my bedroom window was directly across from the Stevens kitchen window, as they lived just 2 doors down. Although I'd tried, I could never get a view of their bedroom, as their thick blackout curtains were shut tightly at all hours. For the first week after I moved in, I learned the Stevens routine. Each morning, Monica would already be at the kitchen table by the time I woke up at 6. She'd sit, her chin propped up against her palm, head buried in her book, and long blonde curls falling in front of her face. It was so cute. When Dylan got up, I could tell she stiffened at his presence. Immediately, he'd begin to berate her. I could see the spittle fly from his mouth as he slammed her book shut, grab his keys, and walk out the door. This was an almost daily occurrence. If he was not screaming in her face, he would sit across from her silently, eat a bowl of cereal, and disappear out the door. When he left, he would not come back again until dinner. I don't know what he would do during the day, but I never cared to find out. He was probably cheating on Monica, that pig. Plus, if I followed him, it would be less time I could spend with my beautiful girl. Hour after hour, Monica would sit at that kitchen table, unmoving. Poor thing was paralyzed with fear. I hadn't known her that long, but I knew I could never let her stay with this asshole. When Dylan got home, he'd walk in and pick her up from her chair and take her to the bedroom. I could hear his insincere apologies, just saying sorry in hopes he'd get laid. They come out an hour later, him placing her back into her wheelchair. I'd watch Monica sit with her back to my window while her doting husband cooked dinner. He cooked in seeming silence, not speaking to her or even acknowledging her presence. It baffled me how that troll could treat a woman of that caliber with such carelessness. Although I could never get a clear view of her face, I could tell she was beautiful, shy, and that he didn't love her like I did. He was so controlling. His wife never left the apartment complex, let alone feel safe enough to even move from the kitchen table during the day. The only time she could come out was Saturday morning. When would I see her on the rooftop garden? I knew she wanted me to save her. After observing their routine for around 2 weeks at that point, I could pinpoint exactly when I could corner Dylan. The morning I planned to confront him, there was a change in the usual routine. While Dylan was in the middle of his screaming session, he struck the back of Monica's head. This sent her forehead slamming down onto their wooden kitchen table. Let me tell you, this set me off. The rest of the routine remained unchanged as at 7 a.m., exactly he would leave their apartment and head for the elevator. Following him, I left at 7:01 so I could catch the elevator right before it closed, wanting to seem nonchalant. I smiled when I walked into the elevator and introduced myself, stating that I was sorry for not formally introducing myself since moving in. I hadn't interacted with him directly when I had signed the lease, just his property manager. He gave me the side eye, so I confidently stuck out my hand to shake his. He grabbed it finally, his tarnished silver wedding ring cold on my hand, and said, "Yeah, I'm the landlord, Dylan." I told him I had noticed his wife's affinity for gardening, and asked if she'd like some company next time. I know, a little early to get to talking about Monica, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't spend any more time exchanging pleasantries with this asshole either. That's when something strange happened. He turned to me and grabbed my forearm, squeezing so tight that it was painful. He shoved me forcibly against the elevator wall and said, "Listen, bitch, I know you've been stalking my wife. She wants you to leave her alone." The elevator door dinged and opened. He let go of my arm and walked straight out without another word. Straight through the complex doors to his car and drove off. I stood shocked. What the hell was that? But I had gotten what I came for, and that was all that mattered. That whole leave her alone was such an obvious lie. It confirmed to me that she needed my help. Dylan was becoming more unhinged by the day, and this episode in the elevator was proof. I went straight back up to my apartment, already thinking of what I was going to do on Saturday morning when she got to that garden. It was already Friday evening by the time Dylan got back from his daily escapades. I dreamed of her that night, about finally turning her around, seeing that gorgeous face that was no longer hiding from Dylan, professing my love, and running away together. We'd get a cottage so she could garden, but live near the city so we could people watch together. We'd both be free and happy. Saturday morning came, and I woke up early to prepare my things. When Dylan woke up, he went immediately to find Monica in the kitchen. He lit into her first thing. It was too muffled to hear exactly what he was saying, but loud enough that I could hear through their closed window. I could see her distress. She couldn't even lift her head to defend herself. This poor beaten-down woman was counting on me, but it wasn't too much longer now. Dylan forcefully grabbed her wheelchair and wheeled her out of the apartment, heading for the roof. I watched as he dumped her there, screaming a final time, saying, "You can just rot out here. I don't even care anymore." Dylan disgusted me. I wished I could rush up there and take her away right then. However, I knew I had to wait for Dylan to depart if I wanted to avoid a confrontation. Half an hour later, I approached the elevator so that I could reach the rooftop garden. As the elevator rose, I took a deep breath. Was I going to do this? Confess my love to this married woman and propose that we run away from her abusive husband together? I guessed so, because a moment later, I was stepping out from the elevator and into the small hallway that ended with the final obstacle between me and my love. As I approached the door that led on top the roof, I felt the hot summer air begin to seeping in. I turned the knob and stepped onto the bright roof. There she was, Monica. That silky blonde hair was instantly recognizable. It had fallen and covered her face slightly so that she couldn't quite see me approach. I walked over slowly as I didn't want to startle her, but then my emotions took over. I grabbed her shoulder, spun her around, and closed my eyes right before I professed my love. But I got no response. I mean, nothing. Not a screw you, not an I love you too. Silence. I opened my eyes, expecting to meet the eyes of a beautiful woman. Instead, I gagged. She had no eyes. They were gone. No eyebrows either. They were replaced with thick black stitches that held her eyelids together. Her eyes were completely sewn shut. My eyes traveled down to her nose. She had a maggot hanging out of her right nostril, and it turned to crawl into her left one. She was a repulsing pale color with burst veins littering her skin, then down to her mouth. It was sewn as well, and her lips were gone, ripped off her face. Her mouth was sewn into a line, no smile, no frown, completely straight and emotionless. Beyond that, her legs were completely gone. I was expecting her to have been intact. I mean, I knew she was in a wheelchair, but her legs looked like they had been sawed off. They were jaggedly rotting, not being cauterized of anything. I couldn't look anymore. I ran to the hallway leading back to the elevator, vomiting once I had gotten the door shut behind me. I ran to my apartment where I deadbolted the door behind me and sunk down into a fetal position, sobbing. I felt indescribable loss and anger. What had he done to my beautiful future wife? He mutilated her. And he thought I was going to let him get away with this? I had no weapons beside a massive hammer from an old toolbox I had under my sink. I stalked my way to the Stevens apartment and broke the doorknob off with the hammer. Kicking the door in, I wanted to avenge my love. The apartment had an atmosphere so grotesque, so depraved, so much more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. I walked into the door and smelt rotting flesh seeping from the walls. The only light came from the singular kitchen window, the one I had stared into so many times, the one I had never imagined would hold this horror lurking in the spots I couldn't see. Right by the window, just out of the view I could see from my apartment, was a meat hook. And there in the dim apartment hung Monica's left leg. He was going to eat her leg. I nearly puked on the kitchen table. I couldn't bring myself to leave, though. No matter how much my brain said to run, my feet kept taking me further into the apartment. I entered their bedroom. Dried blood splatter stained the walls and floors. It looked fairly faded. How long ago had he killed her? I knew it hadn't been long, but I believed that the whole time I had been living in this apartment, she had been dead. I gazed into my apartment window as I re-entered the kitchen, imagining how untainted my mind had been just hours ago. I began to panic. I wanted to call the police. I had impenetrable evidence against Dylan. Not only was Monica slumped over on the roof, but his apartment was a striking and completely incriminating crime scene. Before I attempted to get help, I knew I had to get Monica somewhere safe. I started my way out of the kitchen, making my way back to the front door. But then a voice rang out from just outside the front door. "What the hell?" Dylan yelled. He broke the routine. I had no chance of running. I ducked back into the bedroom and slid quietly into the attached bathroom. I could hear his thudding footsteps grow closer and closer as he threatened and yelled, "I have a gun! Whatever creep is in here, I have a gun!" It was time for me to avenge Monica. I heard him enter the bedroom. I gripped the hammer in my hand, charged out of the bathroom, and swung. I hit him directly in the left temple. He screamed, contorting with pain. I dropped the hammer and fled back to my apartment, adrenaline carrying me the whole way there. All I could focus on was getting his blood off me. When the police searched the apartment, they were in shock at the scene. It wasn't me that called them, but another tenant down the hall. By the time I was finished washing myself and disposing of my bloodied clothes, Monica had been found by police. Coroners came and wrapped up her frail body. They lifted her up and she was gone. I didn't even get to say goodbye. 2 days later, I went to her closed casket funeral. It was a fairly publicized affair, being how brutally tortured she had been. I stood in the back, and after the burial, I left. My car packed with everything I owned, I left the city. I still dream of her, of dancing in the kitchen, of how our lives could have been, of her beautiful sewn face. Monica, you're gonna love my new place. It's the cottage we've always wanted. I can't wait to pick you up soon. See you then. I took a job surveying an abandoned house. Now I know why it was empty for 130 years. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd get spooked by a good horror movie or jump at an unexpected noise in the dark, but I always chalked it up to an overactive imagination. That changed last summer when I took a job that led me to the old Hartley house at the end of Willow Street. Now, I'm not sure what I believe anymore, but I know one thing for certain. Evil exists. And sometimes it finds a home in the most unexpected places. It started innocently enough. I'm a 23-year-old architecture student, and I was thrilled to land a summer internship with a local historical preservation society. My first major assignment was to survey and document the Hartley House, a decrepit Victorian mansion that had stood abandoned for decades. The plan was to assess its condition and determine if restoration was feasible. The house had a reputation, of course. Every small town has that one creepy old building that's the subject of endless rumors and dares. Kids would dare each other to spend the night there, but no one ever did. Not really. There were whispers about the Hartley family, how they'd all died mysteriously over a century ago, how the house had stood empty ever since. But I didn't put much stock in ghost stories and urban legends. My first visit to the house was on a sweltering July afternoon. The taxi dropped me off at the end of the overgrown driveway, and I remember thinking the place like something out of a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered brick and warped wood, with a tower on one side and a wraparound porch thick with vines. Most of the windows were boarded up, but I could see hints of stained glass behind the boards on the upper floors. As I approached the front door, key in hand, I felt a strange reluctance. It was like walking through molasses, each step harder than the last. I chalked it up to nerves and the oppressive heat. When I finally reached the porch, the wood creaked ominously under my feet. The key stuck in the lock at first, but with a bit of jiggling, it turned. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. The smell hit me first, musty and thick, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit. I stepped inside, my shoes leaving prints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. The entry hall was grand, even in its state of decay. A sweeping staircase dominated the space. its once elegant banister now warped and splintered. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing glimpses of bare plaster beneath. To my left and right, open doorways led to what I assumed were the parlor and dining room. I spent that first day taking measurements and photos, scribbling notes about structural integrity and potential restoration challenges. It was tedious work, but I found myself oddly fascinated by the house. Every room seemed to hold whispers of its former glory. Ornate moldings, fragments of expensive wallpaper, the occasional glint of tarnished brass. It wasn't until I reached the second floor that things started to feel off. I was in what appeared to be a child's bedroom, documenting the remains of a once cheerful nursery. Faded circus animals still danced across one wall, their painted eyes seeming to follow me as I moved around the room. I was crouched down, examining the base of an old rocking horse, when I heard it, the clear, unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. The sound had come from somewhere above me, muffled but distinct. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the house had fallen silent once again. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty room. No response. I told myself it must have come from outside, maybe some kids playing in a neighboring yard. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound had been too close, too clear. I finished my work in that room quickly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. As I stepped back into the hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the thick dust coating the floorboards, was a set of small footprints. They led from the room I'd just left to the base of the attic stairs at the end of the hall. Child-sized footprints. Fresh ones. I stared at them for a long moment, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. Had some neighborhood kids snuck in while I was working? But I would have heard the front door open, and besides, these prints seemed to appear out of nowhere. There was no dust disturbed leading up to them. Against my better judgment, I followed the prints to the attic stairs. They went up a few steps before disappearing. The attic wasn't on my survey list for the day, but I knew I wouldn't be able to rest if I didn't check it out. The stairs creaked with every step, the sound impossibly loud in the silent house. At the top was a heavy wooden door, warped with age. It took some effort, but I managed to push it open. The attic was a cavernous space, the sloped ceiling creating deep shadows in the corners. Dust motes danced in the few rays of sunlight that managed to pierce the grime-covered windows. The air was thick and stifling, carrying that same sickly sweet odor I'd noticed downstairs, but stronger here. I swept my flashlight across the room, taking in piles of forgotten furniture and stacks of mildewed boxes. Nothing seemed out of place or recently disturbed. I was about to turn back when my light caught something that made my heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a rocking chair. And it was moving. Slowly, steadily, as if someone had just vacated it. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the gently swaying chair. The creaking of its runners seemed to grow louder, drowning out the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I stood there, flashlight trained on that corner, before I finally managed to back out of the attic. I practically flew down the stairs, my earlier skepticism completely forgotten in the face of blind panic. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house and halfway down the overgrown driveway. Only then did I pause to catch my breath, hands on my knees as I gulped in the warm summer air. When I finally looked back at the house, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. There, in a second-floor window, was a face, a child's face, pale and solemn, staring down at me. Our eyes met for the briefest moment before the figure melted away into the shadows. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I quit the internship, told the Historical Society to demolish the place, and never looked back. But that's not what happened. Because the thing is, I went back, again and again over the next few weeks. Each time something inexplicable would happen. Objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, the sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. But instead of driving me away, these occurrences only fueled my obsession with the house and its secrets. I threw myself into researching the Hartley family history, spending countless hours in the local library poring over old newspapers and town records. What I found chilled me to the bone. The Hartleys weren't just any wealthy family. They were involved in something dark, something that the papers of the time only hinted at in vague terms. There were rumors of occult practices, of children going missing in nearby towns. And at the center of it all was Edgar Hartley, the family patriarch. From what I could piece together, Edgar had been obsessed with the idea of immortality. He'd traveled the world, studying ancient texts and obscure rituals. When he returned to Willow Street, he was a changed man. That's when the disappearances started. The official story was that the entire Hartley family, Edgar, his wife, and their 3 children, died of influenza in the winter of 1891. But I found whispers of a different tale, of screams heard coming from the house on a moonless night, of lights in the attic windows and chanting in an unknown language. The more I uncovered, the more I felt drawn to the house. It was like it was calling to me, revealing its secrets one by one. I started spending more time there, long after my official work hours were over. I'd sit in the rooms for hours, waiting, watching, listening. And then one night, everything changed. I was in the attic again, drawn there by the persistent feeling that I was on the verge of understanding something crucial. The rocking chair was still, but I could feel a presence in the room, watching me. "I know you're here," I said aloud, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I want to understand. What happened in this house?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a whisper, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. "He's still here." A chill ran down my spine. "Who? Edgar?" The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whisper came again, louder this time, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "He never left. He's waiting. He's always waiting." Suddenly, the room exploded into chaos. Every object not nailed down began to levitate. Chairs, boxes, old picture frames. They swirled around me in a vortex of dust and debris. Through the maelstrom, I saw figures taking shape, translucent, ghostly forms of children, their faces contorted in terror. And behind them, a larger shape was coalescing. A tall, gaunt figure in an old-fashioned suit. As I watched in horror, its features became clearer. Sunken eyes, a wide, leering grin, and hands that ended in long, claw-like fingers. It was Edgar Hartley. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel grinding against my skull. "Welcome, my dear. We've been waiting so long for someone like you. Someone to continue my work." I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The ghostly children swirled around me, their whispers growing urgent. "Run! You must run!" Edgar's form glided closer, those terrible hands reaching for me. "You've come so far, learned so much. Join us. Join me. We have such wonders to show you." In that moment, I understood the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. A prison for the souls Edgar had taken, and a lure for new victims. And I had walked right into it. With every ounce of will I possessed, I broke free of the paralysis that gripped me. I ran, Edgar's enraged howl following me as I fled down the attic stairs. The entire house seemed to come alive around me, doors slamming, floorboards buckling, the very walls pulsing like a living thing. I didn't stop running until I was far down Willow Street, the sound of my own panicked breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally dared to look back, I saw the house standing silent and dark once more. But in an upper window, I could just make out a figure, tall and thin, watching me retreat. I quit the internship the next day, told them I was sick, that I couldn't complete the project. I tried to warn them about the house, but who would believe such a fantastical story? As far as I know, the Hartley house still stands at the end of Willow Street, waiting for its next victim. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you ever find yourself in a small town with a house that everyone avoids, a house with a dark history and a bad reputation, stay away. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Because sometimes the monsters we tell ourselves don't exist are all too real. And sometimes they're just waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to invite them back into the world. I thought I didn't believe in ghosts. Now I know better. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of old houses and forgotten histories. And once you've seen them, once you know they're real, you can never truly escape. So if you're ever driving down Willow Street and you see an old Victorian house at the end, keep driving. Don't slow down. Don't look back, because Edgar Hartley is still there, and he's always waiting for someone new to join his family. My mother-in-law was poisoning me, then I found out why. Everyone has their own nightmare in-law story, though I couldn't imagine how bad mine would be. As it turns out, the worst thing wasn't my mother-in-law poisoning me. The worst thing was why she did it. I met Craig on one of my rare vacations, and we had sort of a whirlwind relationship. We fell hard for each other, and were married in a courthouse wedding within 2 months without ever meeting each other's families. Mine visited a few weeks later, and after their initial shock, really liked Craig. While we got moved in together and figured out married life, I got to hear more about his parents who lived near the rest of his extended family a few hours away, though we never saw them. My work schedule is rough. I work 6 to 7 days a week, and my off days are a blur of appointments and errands. I think in the 2 years before I met Craig, I only left the city once. I finally got a few days off, so we could head to visit his family about 6 months later. His whole family came over, and everyone seemed thrilled to meet me, except for his mom, Betsy. She was cold and distant, and could sit there without saying a single word to me. It was creepy, but I kept trying to spark up a conversation. On our last day, he announced that we should take an afternoon hike up into the national park, which their house sat on the edge of. Betsy made lunch, and I was changing to go out when it hit me, just waves of nausea. I wound up in the bathroom for hours that afternoon. I figure it was just a touch of something and thought nothing of it. We went back a few months later and again had a great time except for Betsy. She wouldn't talk to me, though Craig brushed it off and said she was just getting to know me. He finally said we could rent jet skis the next day and explore a lake in the next town as a way to get out of the house and unwind, which made me feel better. I was so excited to tell everyone where we were going, but it wasn't to be. After eating, I got so sick I could barely walk for the next 2 days. At this point, I started to get suspicious. No one else was sick, and we all ate the same food. It seemed like Betsy must have been up to something, but it wasn't until our next visit, when a night in a romantic cottage another hour up the road was canceled due to me getting sick, that I was sure Betsy was poisoning me. Craig said I was insane. He said it must be an allergy to something his mom used in her cooking, which actually made sense, though I never had time for an appointment to get it checked out. Still, I decided on the next trip that I'd make a big casserole and bring it with us. If I cooked the food and served it, nothing could be added. Well, I hadn't had 2 bites before I realized I had left the wine I was drinking unattended while I was heating up the casserole, and my stomach was already doing flips. You know what happened next, and it was not pretty. I was so sure his mom was poisoning me, and I confronted Craig about it. I told him I wouldn't visit his family again if she was there. It was our first big fight, but he finally said he wouldn't force me to visit, and we could figure out how best to deal with the situation. She had never been nice to me, so it wasn't a loss. The next time I got time off, we decided we'd head to that little cottage we had rented before and not been able to use. We were driving right past his family's place, and it seemed rude not to stop, so we compromised and bought some pizzas. I even decided just not to drink anything unless it was water from the tap. We got in and threw pizza on our plates when one of his cousins arrived, and everyone briefly left the food unattended. I realized my mistake almost immediately and decided to try an experiment. Craig and I both had 2 slices, so I just switched our plates while everyone was in the next room. Craig was so sick I was really worried about him. The drive back to the city was awful. We had to pull off a lot, and he was a mess. We had been back home for 3 days before I broke down and told him I had switched the plates. I've never seen such anger before. The rage in his eyes is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He shoved me into a wall and then came flying at me. He threw me over the couch, but I somehow managed to grab my keys and phone and ran out the door not even wearing shoes. I got lucky with the elevator and made it to a friend's place safely, finally turning off my phone after I missed his 47th call. I had no idea what to do or when it would be safe to go home, it was the scariest time of my life. It was 2 days before I turned my phone back on, and when I heard the message from the police, I drove upstate immediately. Craig was dead. Betsy had shot him after he broke into her house and charged at her with a knife. I learned that Craig had been married once before, and his wife had died on a tragic hiking accident. Craig made a lot of money in the life insurance payout, and Betsy always suspected Craig had killed her, and was nervous about letting him be alone with me, especially out in the remote area he was so familiar with from his childhood. So she ensured that every time he planned an outing that I would be sick. It wasn't easy, but she didn't think I would believe her, as no one else had ever shared her suspicions about Craig. I found the life insurance policies he took out on me without my knowledge afterward, and refused to press charges against Betsy. She was only trying to protect me. I still visit her from time to time when I need to get out of the city, and I must say, I love her cooking. My town holds a special light ceremony every year. The parade always started with the beating of the drums at midnight. The drummers were first in line, leading on the rest of the parade. The monotonous thudding would evoke the bittersweet feeling of anticipation inside of me. It meant that the most exciting day of the year in our town had finally arrived, but that it would also be over soon. The sound would be followed by dozens of warm lights, held by townspeople in long white robes, moving through the narrow streets with determined gazes. The rest of us would stand by the sidelines, watching the lights while hypnotized by the steady beating of the drums. The parade ended at the marketplace in the center of town, where usually the market was held, with a big party. The lanterns would be attached all around the big place that was filled with booths and food trucks. There would be music and dancing, usually until the sun came up again. For the first 17 years of my life, I had always only been a spectator, but this year, I would finally carry one of the lanterns and be right in the middle of the excitement. I lied and changed my birthday on the application. You had to be 18 to be a carrier, but my birthday was still a week away. But it worked. When I received the letter with my official invitation to be a carrier, I shrieked so loud that my parents thought I was going mad. My father was born in town and had carried a lantern himself a few times when he was younger, but my mother only moved here with him a few years before I was born. Carriers couldn't be older than 30, so she had never walked among them, but she always insisted that she didn't mind because she found the parade itself slightly eerie. She only liked the party. I can't exactly blame her. From an outside perspective, it can feel a little odd, the marching, the outfits, and all that fire. But when you have an open mind, you see it for the wonderful tradition it is. And that's how I saw it, or at least used to. I thought it was an honor to be among the carriers, and the cherry on top was that my best friend June was chosen as well. When the day of this year's parade finally came, I was more than prepared. I had picked up my robe earlier in the morning and ironed it. It was a little too big for me, so I had to make sure to be careful not to trip. I'd eaten a carb-loaded dinner and gone to the toilet 3 times before leaving the house, so I definitely wouldn't have to pee during the march. June picked me up at 10 a.m., and together we made our way to the meeting point on the outskirts of town. Most people who saw us in our robes on our way there smiled at us and waved, but some also had solemn looks on their faces. "I can literally feel the excitement in the air," I said to my friend. "Yeah," she mumbled. "But have you noticed how weird some people are looking at us?" I shrugged. "They're probably just jealous." As I said those words, I noticed a woman in her front lawn staring at us while watering the bit of grass in front of her. As we got closer, I saw that the water was even reaching her shoes, but for some reason, she didn't move. Even when the can was clearly empty, she was still holding it tilted. A shudder went through me, and I moved my gaze away from her. "Anyway, not our problem." I linked my arm with June's and quickened my pace. "And how excited are you for the party? This is the first time my parents will let me stay out all night for it." A grin spread all over her face. "You mean the first time they know you stayed all night?" The meeting point was already packed with people. Most were wearing robes like us, but there were also volunteers handing out lanterns and matches, as well as some water bottles and energy bars. The drummers were readying their instruments, and this year's parade leader, Maximus Abrams, walked around with a clipping board, explaining to everyone which position they would have in line. Maximus was an overly excited citizen of our town. Everyone who lived here knew him, but I found him rather insufferable. He always wore the sharpest-smelling cologne, had far too much gel in his shoulder-length hair, and loved to be involved in all types of town business. When he reached us, he gave us a warm smile. "First-time carriers?" he said as a way of greeting us. We both nodded. "Wonderful. We're excited to have you in this year's parade. I'm sure you will have a marvelous time." He took a quick look at his clipping board. "I'll put you both in the 7th line so you can be together. But," and he really emphasized that word, "no chatting during the march. The only sound will be from the drummers. You have to be focused, keep the pace, and whatever happens, do not get distracted. There are marchers behind you, and if you suddenly stop or trip, we will have a line of dominoes all falling on top of each other." He stared at us with eyes so wide that I thought they might pop out any second. "Yes, of course," June said, the side of her lip slightly tucking upward. "Fantastic. And remember, you do not light your lanterns before you hear the drums." With that last instruction, he left us and moved on to the next people. The last hour passed in a heartbeat, and before I knew it, we were already getting in position. June was on the left, and I was in the middle, and then the person who would be on my right showed up. "Hey, Cassie," I heard a familiar male voice. "Oh, hi, Darian," I smiled. Darian lived in my neighborhood, and his parents were friends with mine, so I'd met him a few times before. It was 5 minutes before midnight, when one by one the few houses around us all turned dark. It would be the same on the other streets on the road. It was custom that anyone who was still at home would turn out their lights, so the lanterns had an even stronger effect on the night. "I don't think I'll ever get used to this," Darian mumbled. "Have you done this before?" I asked. "Only once, last year." I saw June peeking over from my left side. "How was it?" she asked. "Kind of freaky, but fun. To be honest, I don't even remember much of the night," he laughed. Someone behind us shushed us, and we stopped talking. Next, the street lanterns turned dark, and as we stood there in the pitch-black night, not making a single sound, the first drum signaled that it was midnight. It was followed by the other drums, beginning a steady beat and signaling to us that it was time to light the fires. I looked over at my best friend and saw her smile light up in the warm light. And then we started marching. As we walked further into town, we noticed more and more people by the sides watching us and the lanterns. We kept our promise and kept quiet. Suddenly I forgot all about my too long robe or the fear of tripping. I felt like I belonged with the people around me, and I didn't look over, but I was sure that June felt the same way. I lost all sense of direction and couldn't even say if we'd already passed my house, but it didn't matter. All that mattered were the people around us, the children watching with big eyes and bright smiles. But as we walked further, something shifted in the atmosphere. At the beginning, I could still hear people calling to us or cheering, but suddenly the spectators were eerily quiet, as if they were frozen in time. The smiles disappeared from the children's faces, watching us with tilted heads. The empty expressions of the adults resembled the ones of the lady on the lawn. I tore my gaze away from them and simply stared at my lantern. It felt as if my heart was beating as loudly as the drums, and I started feeling nauseous. From the corner of my eye, I saw some movement on my left. I slowly turned my face toward June and noticed that she was watching me. She was watching me while she was walking, not missing a single step. And then her mouth opened wide as if she was screaming, but there was no sound. I opened my own mouth to say something, but no words came out, and then I could have sworn that for a second, her eyes turned white as sheets. I was so in shock that I didn't notice that my robe had caught under my shoe. I tripped and was close to falling when Darian grabbed my arm and steadied me. Luckily, I'd managed to hold on to my lantern. It was a trick of my imagination. I had to keep walking on, I tried to tell myself. In reality, I was just too scared to look at June again. The rest of the parade passed in a haze, and before I knew it, we had reached the town center. The people started spreading around to find places for their lanterns. Finally, I dared to look at my friend, but she was gone. I tried to call June, but she wouldn't pick up, so I walked around the festival, looking for my parents or other friends, but there were too many people and the loud noises from every other corner distracted me. So I aimlessly continued walking around with no real target in sight, but I started noticing something odd. Most people were enjoying themselves, but there were a few who caught my attention. When I passed the carnival ride, the old-fashioned horses going round and round in circles, I felt a woman was watching me. I stopped right in front of the ride, and the woman's gaze was on me every time the horse passed. At first, her face was serious, but with each turn, her smile started to spread, wider and wider. I shook off the shudder that went through me and walked on. But then I noticed more people watching me, all with that hungry gaze. Some of them were in small groups, but most walked alone. I tried my best to ignore them until I finally spotted a familiar face at the cider booth. My mom was chatting with friends. Her cheeks were rosy, and she looked so happy that I finally felt a moment of peace and safety. I felt even more relieved when she told me that she met a completely fine June in one of the drinking tents. That's when I decided to call it a night and head home. On my way to the exit, however, I bumped into Darian. "Aren't you dying in that?" he asked. "What?" I murmured. He pointed to the thick robe I was still wearing and laughed. "It's like 1,000,000 degrees tonight." "Oh, I forgot about that." His smile turned into a frown. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I looked around to see if anyone was close enough to hear us. "Did you notice something weird during the parade?" "Like what?" "The people. The atmosphere. I don't know." Darian moved a hand through his dark hair but stayed silent for a moment. "Kind of," he finally admitted. "I thought it was just me. I mean, the monotonous beats and the lights, I think they put me in a hypnotic state or something. I only snapped out when I noticed you tripped. But I didn't really look at the people before, just at my light." I nodded. "The hypnosis thing kind of makes sense," I laughed. "Maybe I hallucinated a little. Anyway, I'm heading home. Have a good night." "Are you sure you're okay? I can walk with you if you want." "No, it's fine. It's not far and there are still a bunch of people around." There weren't a bunch of people around. All the streets that weren't in the town center were empty, and suddenly I regretted not taking Darian up on the offer to walk me home. I steadied my pace, and just as I was rushing around a corner, I bumped into someone. The smell of sharp cologne immediately hit my nose. "Hello there, carrier." "Carry the carrier," he said as a big grin spread on his face. He just appeared out of nowhere. Why was he not at the festival? "Oh, hi. Glad to see you're still wearing your robe. Not many take the ceremony seriously enough." "Uh-huh, sure. All I wanted was to get home. Small talk with Maximus was the last thing on my mind." "Do you feel it? The shift in the atmosphere? It's getting more and more right each year." His grin stayed on the entire time. Then he started staring at me as if he was trying to look through me. And then he did the strangest thing ever. He started sniffing me. Suddenly, a deep sense of unease settled in my gut. Something told me to get away as quickly as possible. "My dad is expecting me. I should really get home," I lied. He nodded. "Not yet, I see," he whispered, the grin leaving his face. "What?" "I could have sworn it would be you. But don't worry, you still have time to be chosen." I wondered if I should just push him and run or whether I was being paranoid. But before I could make the choice, I heard footsteps behind us. My heart almost left my chest as I saw who was approaching us in a long white robe. "June," I muttered, relief rushing through me. She embraced me from behind, her nails digging into my stomach. She smelled foul, like sulfur, and when she spoke, her breath felt cold against my skin. "What a wonderful night. What a wonderful world," she whispered. Then her eyes went to Maximus, and they just stared at each other. She let go of me and took a step away. And then I saw it again. This time I was sure I wasn't imagining it. Her eyes turned white as paper. And as I looked at Maximus, I realized that so were his. I stumbled back and hit the wall of a house. June simply started laughing. My breathing became so fast that I started seeing black in front of my eyes. The last thing I wanted was to pass out at his exact moment. "Hey, Cassie!" A new voice pulled me out of my sudden trance. It was Darian, walking up to us. I glanced at June and Maximus, whose eyes had turned back to normal. June gave me the sweetest smile. "You." I remember you, Maximus said in a deep voice at Darian. He loved you, thought about you as his soul shriveled away. Too bad he couldn't even be buried, but maybe you can join him next year. What are you talking about, man? Darian nervously laughed. June interlocked her arm with Maximus. Enjoy your night, sweetie. She winked at me, and they proceeded to walk away. What the fuck just happened? The relaxed look on Darian's face disappeared the second the other two left. I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. So instead I asked, "Why did you follow me?" "You seemed really out of it. I wanted to make sure you were okay." I wasn't sure if I could trust Darian or if I could trust anyone, but I also didn't feel like walking around alone, and at least the other two left when he showed up, so I let him walk me home. The light at the front of our house was on. My father was sitting on the steps leading up to the porch, looking into the distance. When he saw me, there was sadness in his eyes. "I forgot," he whispered. "I forgot what it's like. I always forget." "Dad, what are you talking about?" I kneeled on the steps in front of him. He looked so weak all of a sudden, so broken. Every year we celebrate, and every year we forget what changes. It's a ceremony. We hold a ceremony for them, and we don't even know it. We present ourselves with the lights, and they take one of us. Just replace them. Darian got closer, but we both stayed silent, waiting for my father to continue. He gently put his hand on my cheek. "I saw you among them. It went by so fast, I'd forgotten what happens. I always forget. But you're okay. You are yourself, aren't you?" "Dad," I started, but then he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, it was as if he'd awoken from something. He quickly shook his head and smiled. "Oh, honey, you're home already." The sad expression vanished from his face. "Hello, Darian. We saw the two of you together in the parade. Did you have a good time?" Darian nodded, but kept staring at my dad. "Alrighty, I'm heading to bed. Don't stay out too late, yeah?" He winked at me and made his way up the stairs and through the door before I could stop him. "What in the actual hell is going on?" I muttered. Darian sat down on the stairs next to me. "I don't know. I know it sounds completely insane, but what your father just said sounds familiar. I keep thinking, but just as the thoughts form, they vanish again." I grabbed him by the shoulders and fixed my gaze on him. "Try to think. Remember, you were a carrier last year. What do you remember?" He kept looking into my eyes, his expression empty. But then he blinked a few times and tears started forming in the corners of his eyes. "My brother," he whispered. "I went to the parade with my brother last year. He was older than me, moved out when I was 10, and even though he lives here, we lost almost all touch with him. Until last year, when he reached out to me and convinced me to sign up for the parade." "What happened to him, Darian?" A tear slid down his cheek, and suddenly I understood. "Maximus is your brother." I took his hand in mine, and together we just sat there, defeated and scared. We sat there until the memories disappeared from Darian's mind again, and I was alone. All alone with the knowledge of something horrific that nobody in town would ever believe. All alone, mourning the life of my best friend. I try to remember June's smile in the warm light, the look of anticipation and happiness in her eyes. I try to think about that, and not of the moment everything was ripped from her. When her eyes disappeared, when she tried to scream for help, but nobody could hear her. How the same thing must have happened to Darian's brother and countless other people here, and how it will happen again next year.